To understand the miracle of the iron spine that would one day bind the North American continent together, one must first understand the silence of the map. In the year 1862, the United States was a fractured land torn apart by a civil war that raged in the east, but in the west there was only vast quiet distance. Imagine, if you will, the city of Washington, D.C., not as the marble fortress of today, but as a muddy, unfinished town, where the dome of the Capitol building stood half-completed, open to the rain and the grey sky. It is here, in a dim office filled with the smell of stale tobacco smoke and old paper, that the dream began to take its final shape. Abraham Lincoln, a man carrying the weight of a divided nation on his shoulders, sat before a desk cluttered with maps. The maps showed a land that was terrifying in its emptiness. To the west of the Missouri River lay the Great Plains, a sea of grass that rippled in the wind, like the ocean stretching for endless miles toward the setting sun. Beyond the plains rose the Rocky Mountains, a jagged wall of stone that had stopped travelers for centuries. And beyond them, the high-dry deserts of the Great Basin, leading finally to the formidable granite fortress of the Sierra Nevada. To reach California from New York in 1862 was a journey of months. One could sail all the way around the tip of South America, a voyage that took perilous weeks through stormy seas. One could risk the fever-ridden jungles of Panama to cross the isthmus. Or one could board a stagecoach and endure 20 days of bone-shaking travel across the dust and heat of the overland route. California felt like another planet. It was an island of gold and opportunity cut off from the rest of the Union by the sheer impossible scale of the geography. But in the quiet of that office, with the sound of rain tapping against the window pane, Lincoln picked up a pen. The Pacific Railway Act was waiting. It was a document that promised to bridge this silence, to lay a ribbon of iron across 2,000 miles of wilderness. With a scratch of the nib on parchment, a sound barely louder than a whisper, the president set in motion the greatest engineering feat of the 19th century. It was a dream that existed only on paper. There were no tracks yet. There were no steam engines whistling in the mountain passes. There was only the idea and the will to conquer the distance. Far away from the muddy streets of Washington on the other side of the continent, the dream was also alive in the mind of a man named Theodore Judah. Judah was an engineer, a man obsessed with the impossible. While others looked at the Sierra Nevada mountains and saw an impenetrable barrier, Judah saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. He spent his days hiking through the high, thin air, climbing over granite boulders and wading through deep snowdrifts, searching for a path. He carried a barometer and a notebook, measuring the elevation, calculating the grades, mapping the curves. He was often alone, surrounded by the immense silence of the peaks, where the only sound was the wind rushing through the needles of the giant pine trees. He envisioned a railroad that would not fight the mountain, but work with it, clinging to the ridges rising steadily into the clouds. He drew lines on his maps that no one else could see. He spoke of tunnels bored through solid rock of trestles, bridging deep canyons of snow sheds that would protect the tracks from the crushing weight of winter avalanches. Back in Sacramento, the air was thick with the river mist on the morning of January 8th, 1863. This is where the physical work began. It was not a grand, explosive start, but a quiet, ceremonial one. A small crowd gathered near the banks of the Sacramento River. The ground was damp and cold. The sky was a flat sheet of gray. Leland Stanford, the governor of California and one of the big four investors who backed the Central Pacific Railroad, stood holding a shovel. There were speeches made words that drifted away on the damp breeze about the unity of the nation and the march of progress. But the reality was the mud. When Stanford turned the first shovelful of earth, it was heavy and wet. Straw was spread over the muddy ground to keep the dignitaries' boots clean. There was a brass band that played, but the music sounded thin against the vast backdrop of the valley. This first shovel of dirt was the beginning of a journey that would consume 6 years of blood and sweat. It was the first mark on a canvas that was 2,000 miles wide. As the crowd dispersed and the silence of the afternoon returned, the real work waited. The Central Pacific had to build eastwards away from the ocean and directly into the teeth of the mountains. They faced an immediate challenge. Everything they needed to build a railroad had to be brought by sea. The locomotives, the iron rails, the spikes, the wheels, every single piece of heavy industrial equipment had to be shipped 15,000 miles around Cape Horn. A steam engine ordered in New York would not arrive in San Francisco for months. It was a logistical nightmare unfolding in slow motion. The early days of construction were agonizingly slow. The grading crews moved like ants against the foothills. They used wheelbarrows and carts drawn by mules. The earth was moved one shovel at a time. The air in the camps smelled of wet canvas and boiling coffee. The men slept in tents that flapped in the wind. They woke before dawn, when the mist was still clinging to the oak trees, and worked until the sun dipped below the horizon. The sound of the camp was a low hum of activity, the clinking of metal on stone, the braying of mules, the murmur of voices. Progress was measured in feet, not miles. They were building the grade, the flat earthen bed upon which the tracks would eventually lie. It had to be level. It had to be solid. If the ground rose, they had to cut through it. If the ground fell, they had to fill it in. It was a constant battle for equilibrium. Meanwhile, nearly 2,000 miles to the east, another army was gathering. The Union Pacific. Railroad had been chartered to build westward from the Missouri River. Their starting point was Omaha, Nebraska, a rough frontier town on the edge of the wilderness. Here the landscape was different. There were no mountains, yet only the endless rolling waves of the Great Plains. The challenge here was not gravity, but distance. The Union Pacific had to bring their supplies up the Missouri River by steamboat, or across the plains by wagon. There were no trees on the prairie to make railroad ties. Every piece of wood, every sleeper that would hold the rails, had to be cut in the forests of the north and floated downriver or shipped from the east. The Union Pacific camp was a mobile city. It was a chaotic, bustling place that moved forward with the track. It was known as Hell on Wheels. Imagine a town made of canvas and thin wooden boards that could be dismantled in a day and loaded onto flat cars. There were tents for sleeping, tents for eating, and tents for drinking. There were blacksmith shops where the red glow of the forge lit up the night. There were supply depots stacked high with rails and crates of spikes. At night the camp was alive with the sound of fiddles and the shouts of men, but by day it was a machine of construction. The process of laying track was a rhythmic, hypnotic dance. First came the surveyors, the men with theodolites and chains who marked the path. They walked ahead into the tall grass, leaving behind a trail of wooden stakes. Next came the graders, the men with the shovels, and the horse-drawn scrapers who leveled the earth. They built up the roadbed, creating a long, narrow ridge that stretched toward the horizon. Then came the tiemen. They unloaded the heavy wooden sleepers from the wagons and laid them across the grade spaced perfectly apart. The smell of the freshly cut wood mixed with the dust of the plains. And finally came the iron men. These were the track layers. A flat car loaded with iron rails would be pushed to the end of the line. Two men would step forward and grab the end of a rail. Two men would grab the other end. "Down!" The foreman would shout, and the rail would drop onto the ties with a heavy metallic clang. Then the same for the rail on the opposite side. The gauges would measure the distance between them, ensuring it was exactly 4 feet 8.5 inches. The spikers would step in, swinging their heavy mauls. Clang, clang, clang. The spikes were driven into the wood, locking the rail in place. The flat car would be pushed forward over the newly laid rails, and the process would begin again. It was a rhythm that repeated thousands of times a day. Down, clang, spike, move, down, clang, spike, move. The railroad crept westward like a slow-growing vine. To the listener standing in the vast silence of the Nebraska prairie, the sound of the construction would have been a tiny, rhythmic pulse in an ocean of quiet. The wind blew constantly here, a ceaseless rushing sound that ruffled the buffalo grass. The sky was immense, a giant dome of blue that turned to a blaze of stars at night. The workers were small specks under this vast canopy. They were Irish immigrants, mostly men who had fled the famine and the wars of their homeland to find work in the New World. They were tough men accustomed to hard labor. They worked in rhythm-singing songs to keep the pace. They watched the horizon for the dust clouds that might signal a herd of buffalo or a party of Cheyenne or Sioux warriors. The indigenous tribes of the plains watched the iron horse with growing alarm. They saw the line of wooden poles, the telegraph wires that hummed in the wind, and the 2 lines of iron that cut through the hunting grounds. They called it the Iron Horse. It was a foreign object, a scar on the land that disrupted the ancient migrations of the buffalo. As the tracks pushed further west, the tension grew. But in the early days, it was mostly a struggle against the elements. The heat in the summer was blistering. The sun beat down on the open plains with no shade for miles. The iron rails became so hot they could blister skin. The dust was everywhere. It coated the men's faces, filled their lungs, and turned the water in the barrels into mud. In the winter, the wind turned icy, biting through the canvas tents. Blizzards would sweep down, from the north burying the tracks and halting work for days. Yet the machine moved on. Back in California, the Central Pacific was facing a different kind of war. They had left the valley floor and were hitting the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The easy digging was over. Now they faced the granite. The rock of the Sierra is hard, unyielding stone. It dulled drills and broke shovels. The grade began to steepen. The locomotives puffed and strained to push the supply cars up the incline. The sheer scale of the engineering required was staggering. They had to build curved trestles, wooden bridges that looked like spiderwebs, spun across deep ravines. The timber for these trestles came from the forests around them. Giant redwoods and pines were felled, their smell of sap and sawdust filling the air. The logs were hewn into massive beams and bolted together. One of the most famous spots was Bloomer Cut. It was a ridge of cemented gravel and rock so hard it was like concrete. The workers couldn't dig it, they had to blast it. This brings us to the introduction of black powder. The sound of the railroad in the mountains changed from the clang of iron to the dull thud of explosions. The workers would drill holes into the rock using hand drills and sledgehammers. One man would hold the steel drill bit, turning it slightly after each strike, while another man swung the hammer. Clink, turn, clink, turn. It was a slow, hypnotic rhythm. A team might drill only a few feet in a day. Then the hole was packed with black powder, a fuse was lit, and the men would run for cover. The explosion would shatter the rock, creating a cloud of grey dust and a pile of debris that had to be cleared by hand. It was dangerous work, but the workforce of the Central Pacific was changing. The white workers often left for the silver mines in Nevada, hoping to strike it rich. The railroad needed a reliable army. They found it in the Chinese immigrants. They came from the Guangdong province, fleeing poverty and unrest. They were small men compared to the burly Irish workers, but they possessed an incredible discipline and stamina. They worked in organized teams. They cooked their own food, healthy meals of rice and dried vegetables and tea, which kept them from getting the dysentery that plagued the white workers who drank dirty water. The Chinese workers became the backbone of the Central Pacific. They swarmed over the cuts and the embankments in their blue cotton tunics and wide-brimmed straw hats. They carried the heavy baskets of rock on shoulder poles. They hung from ropes on the sheer cliff faces, drilling holes into the granite while suspended hundreds of feet above the American River. It was a sight of awe-inspiring bravery and patience. The river far below looked like a thin silver thread. The wind roared through the canyon, and there, hanging against the grey stone, were the basket men chipping away at the mountain inch by inch. As the rails climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder. The vegetation changed from the oaks of the valley to the manzanita and scrub of the foothills, and then to the towering pines and firs of the high Sierra. The silence of the mountains was profound, deep, and ancient. The noise of the railroad, the steam whistles, the blasting, the shouting, was swallowed up by the vastness of the landscape. At night, the campfires of the Chinese workers dotted the mountainside like fireflies. The smell of opium and tobacco drifted on the breeze. They were carving a ledge into the side of the mountain, a shelf barely wide enough for a train. This was Cape Horn, a sheer granite buttress that dropped away thousands of feet. There was no place to stand. The workers had to be lowered from above. They drilled, they blasted, and they swung back into the safety of the ropes as the rock face exploded. It was a slow war against the stone, a war of attrition. While the Union Pacific in the east could lay a mile of track a day on the flat plains, the Central Pacific in the west rejoiced if they could gain a few inches. They were building tunnels now. The Summit Tunnel. Tunnel number 6. It had to be. Bored through 1659 feet of solid granite at the very top of the pass. It was the bottleneck. The engineers calculated that at their current rate of hand drilling, it would take years to break through. They worked from both ends. They even sank a shaft down from the top of the mountain so they could work outwards. From the middle, giving them 4 faces to drill. The work went on 24 hours a day, 3 shifts of 8 hours. The sound of the hammers never stopped. Clink, turn, clink, turn. Inside the tunnel, the air was thick with smoke from the black, powder and the oil lamps. It was a dark troglodyte existence. The men emerged from the tunnel covered in grey dust, their eyes blinking in the sunlight or the snow. And then came the winter of 1866. It was a winter of legendary severity. The snow began to fall in November, and it didn't stop. It fell in great, soft flakes blanketing the mountains in white. The snowdrifts grew to be 10 feet, 20 feet, 40 feet deep. The cabins and tents were buried. The workers had to dig tunnels through the snow just to get from their sleeping quarters to the work site. They lived like moles in a white, frozen world. The avalanches were the terror. A whisper of snow high up on a ridge could turn into a roaring, white tidal wave that swept everything in its path, trees, rocks, men, down into the canyons. Entire camps were wiped out, yet the work did not stop. They continued to drill the tunnels protected by the rock, but outside the supply lines were cut. The locomotives were stuck in drifts that towered over their smokestacks. It was a siege by nature against the intrusion of man. But let us drift back to the east, to the plains where the Union Pacific was racing towards the setting sun. They had crossed Nebraska and were entering what is now Wyoming. The landscape was changing. Here too, it was becoming more arid, more broken. The flat horizon was giving way to mesas and buttes, strange rock formations that rose from the dust like ruined castles. The railroad had become a military operation. General Grenville Dodge, the chief engineer, was a veteran of the Civil War. He ran the railroad like an army. The workers were drilled. The supply trains ran on a strict schedule, and they needed protection. The conflict with the Plains Indians had escalated. Survey parties were attacked. Workers were killed. The U.S. cavalry rode alongside the tracks, their blue coats dusty and faded. There were skirmishes, sudden bursts of violence that shattered the quiet of the plains. A train might be derailed, a telegraph wire cut, but the iron snake kept moving. It was unstoppable. The hell-on-wheels towns moved with it. Julesburg, Cheyenne, Laramie. These were towns that sprang up overnight, fueled by whiskey and gambling and the wages of the workers. They were wild, lawless places where the gun was the only law and the cemetery grew faster than the hotel. But as the sun rose over the Laramie plains, the vice faded and the industry returned. The steam shovels hissed. The sledgehammers rang out against the iron rails. The locomotive smoke drifted across the sagebrush like a man-made cloud. The Union Pacific was now moving into the Black Hills of Wyoming. The engineering here was tricky. They had to build high trestles to cross the dry creek beds. The Dale Creek crossing was a nightmare of timber. It was 650 feet long and 150 feet high, a spider web of wood that swayed in the wind. The trains had to creep across it at a walking pace, the engineer holding his breath as the timbers groaned under the weight of the iron horse. Back in the High Sierra, the Central Pacific was fighting the Granite with a new weapon. The black powder was too slow. It was merely puffing at the face of the mountain. A Scottish chemist named James Howden brought a new volatility to the fight. It was nitroglycerin. It was a thick, oily liquid that was as temperamental as a rattlesnake. It had to be mixed on site. The Chinese workers watched with stoic fascination as the chemists poured the acids and the glycerin. It was dangerous. A drop could take off a hand, a jar could level a camp, but its power was undeniable. When the nitro was poured into the drill holes and detonated, the rock did not just crack, it shattered. The granite was pulverized. The sound of a nitro blast was sharper, more cracking than the dull boom of black powder. It echoed down the canyons, shaking the snow from the pine branches miles away. With this new power, the work accelerated, but the mountain fought back with winter. The winter of 1867 was the season of the white silence. The snow fell so heavy and so fast that the camps were completely isolated. The Central Pacific had to build snow sheds. These were essentially long wooden tunnels built over the tracks to protect the trains from the avalanches. Imagine a wooden cathedral stretching for miles. Massive timbers 12 inches thick were hewn and bolted together to form a roof over the railroad. Inside the sheds it was dark and smoky. Outside the snow lay 30 feet deep. The trains would travel through these wooden galleries for nearly 40 miles. It was like traveling through a hollow log. The sound of the train inside the shed was deafening, a roar of trapped noise and smoke. But it allowed the railroad to operate while the storm raged outside. The Chinese workers lived in tunnels dug into the snowbanks. They had underground streets. They had ventilation shafts poking up through the snow like chimneys. It was a surreal, troglodyte existence. They moved from their snow caves to the rock tunnels, rarely seeing the sky or the sun. And then came the breakthrough. August 1867, the Summit Tunnel. The headings met. The engineers from the west face and the east face broke through the final wall of granite. The alignment was perfect. The light from California met the light from Nevada. It was a moment of triumph, but it was celebrated quietly with a handshake and a drink of brandy. Now the Central Pacific began the descent. They had conquered the climb. Now they looked down into the vast expanse of the Great Basin. The landscape changed dramatically. They left the claustrophobic granite canyons and the pine forests and emerged into the high desert. The air was dry and thin. The smell of pine sap was replaced by the smell of sagebrush and alkaline dust. The Reno Valley opened up before them. The tracks could now run straight and fast. But the desert held its own torments. There was no water. For miles and miles, there was nothing but dry, cracked earth and grey scrub brush. Water trains had to carry thousands of gallons to the workers. The heat in the summer shimmered off the ground, creating mirages of lakes that did not exist. This dust was a fine white powder that coated everything. It got into the machinery and ground down the gears. It got into the food. It got into the eyes and throats of the men. The Chinese workers donned wide-brimmed hats and scarves to protect their faces. They moved across the desert floor like a blue army, leaving a trail of iron in their wake. The fingers quickened. Now that they were out of the mountains, the Central Pacific could finally race. They were aiming for the Salt Lake. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific was battling through the red rock canyons of Utah. They were building tunnels too now, but through sandstone and limestone, which was softer than granite, but more treacherous. Rocks would fall without warning. The heat in the canyons was oppressive, trapped between the high red walls. The crews were exhausted. They had been working for years without a break. The rivalry between the two companies was becoming intense. The government paid by the mile and the land grants were valuable, so each company wanted to lay as much track as possible. They were grading parallel lines in some places, passing each other in the desert like ships in the night because Congress had not yet set a meeting point. It was a race of giants. The graders worked miles ahead of the track layers. The dust clouds from the two armies could be seen by each other across the valleys. The Mormon settlers in Utah were hired to help with the grading. They brought their own teams of horses and their own discipline. Brigham Young, the Mormon leader, wanted the railroad to come through Salt Lake City, but the route was too difficult. So it went north through Ogden. The disappointment of the settlers was palpable, but they worked anyway, earning wages to build the Zion in the desert. The rhythm of the rails was reaching a fever pitch, 10 miles a day. That was the record set by the Central Pacific. It was a feat of endurance that seemed impossible. A certain Charles Crocker, one of the Big Four, made a bet that his men could lay 10 miles of track in a single shift. On April 28, 1869, the attempt was made. It was a ballet of logistics. The supply trains backed up. The flat cars were unloaded. The iron rails were dropped. Clang. The spikes were driven. Ping, ping, ping. The train moved forward. It never stopped. The men ran alongside the moving train. They sweated in the desert sun. They worked with a synchronization that was machine-like. By the time the sun went down, they had laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track. It was a record that would never be broken. The armies were now close. They were within shouting distance. The date was set for the meeting. May 10, 1869. The place was Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory. It was a flat, dusty saddle between the mountains. Nothing grew there but sagebrush. On that morning, the sky was a piercing blue with high white clouds drifting slowly. Two locomotives faced each other on the single track. From the west came the Jupiter of the Central Pacific, a wood-burning engine with a large funnel smokestack painted in blue and gold. From the east came the number 119 of the Union Pacific, a sleek coal burner. They stood only a few feet apart, their cowcatchers almost touching. A crowd had gathered. There were the Irish workers in their rough woolen shirts. There were the Chinese workers in their blue tunics, the unsung heroes of the Sierra. There were dignitaries in top hats and frock coats sweating in the sun. There were soldiers in uniform. There were a few photographers with their heavy wooden cameras and glass plates capturing the moment for eternity. The air was filled with a hushed anticipation. The final tie was made of polished California laurel wood. It was placed under the rails. The final spikes were gold and silver. A telegraph wire was attached to the silver spike and another to the sledgehammer so that the sound of the blows could be transmitted instantly to the waiting nation. Imagine the scene, the silence of the desert. The steam hissing quietly from the safety valves of the two engines. Leland Stanford raised the silver hammer. He swung. He missed the spike and hit the wood. The crowd laughed nervously, but the telegraph operator simulated the signal anyway. Click, click, click. The message went out. Done. In Washington, D.C., a magnetic ball dropped from a pole on the Capitol Dome. In San Francisco, a cannon boomed over the bay. In New York, the church bells began to ring. The country was tied together. The iron spine was complete. But up on Promontory Summit, after the cheering stopped and the champagne was drunk and the dignitaries boarded their private cars to ride away, the silence returned. The wind blew through the sagebrush. The sun beat down on the iron rails that shimmered in the heat. The Jupiter and the number 119 backed away. The workers looked at the line of track stretching east and west, disappearing into the curvature of the earth. They were tired. Their hands were calloused and scarred. Their faces were burned by the wind and the sun. They had moved mountains. They had crossed deserts. They had defied the winter, and now it was finished. The continent was no longer a vast, unknown wilderness. It was a place that could be crossed in a week. The journey of months was gone. The separation was over. The steam whistle echoed off. The distant rocks, a lonely sound that marked the end of the frontier and the beginning of a new age. The Iron Horse had won. And as the sun set over the Great Salt Lake, turning the water to gold and the mountains to purple shadows, the tracks lay silent and cold, waiting for the next train, waiting for the future to arrive on steel wheels. This is the story of the iron spine. It is a story written in sweat and black powder and snow. It is a story of a dream on paper that became a reality of steel. And if you listen closely in the quiet of the night, you can still hear the rhythm. Clang, clang, clang. The hammer on the spike. The breath of the steam engine. The heartbeat of a nation connecting itself across the silence. To understand the reality of the railroad, one must leave the sweat of the worker and enter the world of the traveler. It is the year 1870. You are standing on the platform at the Union Pacific Depot in Omaha. The air smells of coal smoke and excitement. Before you stands the train, a long serpent of varnished wood and iron. These are not the rough work trains of the construction era. These are the Silver Palace cars, the Pullman sleepers, the height of Victorian luxury on wheels. You step up the iron stairs and into the vestibule. The heavy wooden door opens, and you enter a world of red plush velvet and polished walnut. The floor is covered in a thick, patterned carpet that muffles your footsteps. The seats are wide and soft, upholstered in a fabric that feels warm to the touch. The windows are large panes of plate glass, framed in heavy curtains, with tassels that sway gently with the movement of the train. Above you, the ceiling is painted with delicate frescoes of cherubs and clouds, and from the center hangs a brass oil lamp with a glass shade etched with flowers. It is a drawing room on wheels, a mobile parlor that promises to carry you across the wilderness in comfort. The conductor calls out, all aboard, a cry that echoes down the platform. The steam whistle blows a long, mournful note that signals the departure. You feel a slight jolt, a shudder that runs through the frame of the car as the couplings tighten, and then slowly, imperceptibly at first, the station begins to slide away. The wooden buildings of Omaha, the piles of luggage, the waving crowds all drift backward. The rhythm begins. Click, clack, click, clack. It is a slow, steady heartbeat. The train gathers speed, moving out of the rail yard and onto the open bridge that spans the Missouri River. You look down at the muddy, swirling water far below the water that once carried the keelboats of the fur traders. Now you cross it in seconds. As the train reaches the other side, the city is left behind and the Great Plains open up before you. It is a landscape of overwhelming horizontal scale. For hours and hours you sit by the window watching the world, unroll like a painted canvas. The grass is tall and green, rippling in the wind like the waves of the sea. There are no fences yet. There are no towns for miles. Just the grass and the sky and the occasional sod house of a brave settler clinging to the earth like a barnacle. You see a herd of antelope racing the train, their white tails flashing as they bound away from the noise and the smoke. You see the shadow of the train itself stretching long and thin across the prairie as the sun begins to set. The light turns, golden, then amber, then purple. The sky becomes a bruised dome of violet and indigo. Inside the car, the porter moves quietly down the aisle, lighting the lamps. The soft yellow glow illuminates the polished wood and the faces of your fellow travelers. There is a businessman from Boston reading a newspaper. There is a family moving west to start a new life in California, the children pressing their faces against the glass. There is a sense of shared adventure, of being suspended between two worlds. And then comes the miracle of the Pullman car. The porter transforms the seats. He pulls them together, slides out the cushions, and lowers the upper berth from the ceiling. Within minutes, the parlor is transformed into a dormitory. Heavy curtains are drawn, creating small private cocoons. You retreat into your berth. The sheets are crisp and white. The blankets are heavy wool. You lie down and listen to the sounds of the night. The rhythm of the wheels changes as the train crosses a culvert or a switch. Clickety-clack, clickety-clack. It is a lullaby. The whistle blows occasionally, a lonely sound that warns the coyotes and the empty darkness that the iron horse is passing. You feel the vibration of the train in your bones, a constant, gentle rocking motion that lulls you to sleep. You are moving at 20 miles an hour across a continent that once killed those who tried to cross it, and you are doing it while wrapped in a blanket dreaming. Morning comes with a streak of pale light through the crack in the curtains. You dress in the swaying privacy of your berth and make your way to the washroom at the end of the car. The water in the basin sloshes gently. You shave with a steady hand, learning to anticipate the movement of the train. And then, breakfast. You move to the dining car. This is another marvel. Tables are set with white linen tablecloths that are clamped down to prevent them from sliding. There is heavy silverware and china plates with the logo of the railroad. The waiter pours hot coffee from a silver pot. You eat eggs and bacon and toast, watching the scenery change. You have climbed in the night. The flat plains are gone. You are now in the high country of Wyoming. The air is thinner here, clearer. The grass is shorter, mixed with sagebrush. Huge granite boulders dot the landscape, looking like sleeping giants. The train is laboring now, the engine puffing harder as it climbs the grade towards Sherman Summit, the highest point on the line. The conductor tells you that you are 8,000 feet above the sea. It is hard to believe. The ascent has been so gradual, so steady. You pass the famous Dale Creek Bridge, and you look down into the rocky gorge, seeing the flimsy-looking trestle that holds you up. It is a moment of vertigo quickly gone. The train descends into the Laramie Plains. You stop at small stations to take on water and coal. These are brief interludes of stillness, the sound of the steam hissing, the clang of the firebox door, the voices of the men on the platform. You step out to stretch your legs. The air smells of pine and sage. The ground is gravel. You are in the middle of nowhere, and yet you are connected to everywhere by these two rails. The journey continues. Day turns into night, and night into day. You cross the red desert where the earth is the color of dried blood. You thread through the canyons of Utah, where the red walls rise up hundreds of feet on either side, echoing the sound of the engine. You pass the Great Salt Lake, shimmering in the distance, like a mirror of steel. You see the Mormon settlements with their neat rows of poplars and their irrigated fields, a patch of green in the wilderness. And then the desert again. The Great Basin. The dust is kept at bay by the double windows of the train, but you can see it swirling outside in dust devils that dance across the alkali flats. It is a landscape of stark beauty and terrifying emptiness. But you are safe inside your velvet palace. You read a book, you write a letter, you talk to your neighbors. The time stretches out elongated by the rhythm of the travel. And finally, the Sierra Nevada. The climb begins again, the air cools, the trees appear, giant pines that tower over the train. You enter the snow sheds, those long wooden tunnels that you heard about. For miles you travel in darkness, the smoke from the engine filling the shed. But you know that outside, there is snow and ice. You emerge from the sheds into the dazzling sunlight of California. The train winds its way down the western slopes, clinging to the cliffs at Cape Horn, where the Chinese workers once hung in baskets. You look down thousands of feet into the American River Canyon, a ribbon of green and blue far below. It is a view that takes your breath away. And then the foothills, the gold country, the red earth of the mining camps, and finally, the Sacramento Valley. The air is thick and warm and smells of flowers and damp earth. You have crossed the continent. What took months by wagon has taken you a week. You step off the train in Sacramento, your legs a bit unsteady on the solid ground. The noise of the station surrounds you, but in your ears you still hear the phantom rhythm. Click, clack, click, clack. You have ridden the iron spine. You have traveled the dream. And as you walk out into the California sunshine, you realize that the world has become smaller. The distance has been conquered. The silence has been broken. The Iron Horse has carried you across the void and delivered you safely to the edge of the Western Sea. Now let us look deeper into the engines themselves, the iron beasts that made this possible. The steam locomotive of the 1860s and 70s was a living, breathing machine. It was not merely a collection of steel and brass, it was a creature with a personality. The Union Pacific favored the 4-40 American-type locomotive. Imagine standing next to one of these giants while it is at rest. It smells of hot oil and ozone and coal dust. The boiler is a long black cylinder, banded with brass. The driving wheels are taller than a man, painted in bright colors, often red or green. The cab is made of varnished wood, usually ash or walnut. The pilot or cowcatcher on the front is a lattice of iron bars designed to sweep obstacles from the track. But the most striking feature is the ornamentation. In this era, locomotives were the pride of the nation, and they were decorated like parade floats. They had names, not just numbers: the Jupiter, the Leviathan, the General Sherman. The steam dome covers were polished brass that shone like gold in the sun. The headlight boxes were painted with landscapes or portraits. The bells were silver-plated. To operate one of these machines was an art form. The engineer stood on the right side of the cab, his hand on the throttle lever. He had to know the track by heart. He had to know every grade, every curve, every bridge. He felt the engine through the soles of his boots. He knew if a bearing was running hot by the smell. He knew if the fire was burning right by the color of the smoke. On the left side of the cab stood the fireman. His job was pure physical labor. He shoveled coal into the firebox hour after hour. He had to keep the pressure up. If the pressure dropped, the train slowed down. If the pressure got too high, the safety valve would pop with a deafening roar. It was a dance of fire and water. The water was carried in the tender behind the engine. It was fed into the boiler, where the fire turned it into steam. The steam expanded, pushing the pistons, which turned the rods, which turned the wheels. It was simple physics, harnessed to move mountains. And the sound. The sound of a steam locomotive is unlike anything else. It is a rhythmic exhalation. Chuff, 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 chuff. It starts slow and deep, a laboring breath, as the wheels struggle to grip the rails. Then as the speed builds, the chuffs blur together into a continuous roar. The whistle was the voice of the train. Every engineer had his own signature on the whistle. Some played it like a musical instrument, a long, lonesome wail that echoed for miles. Others used short, sharp blasts. It was a language of signals. 1. Long blast for approaching a station. 2 short blasts for starting. 3 short blasts for backing up. 4 short blasts for danger. The people of the plains learned to read these sounds. They knew when the mail train was coming. They knew when the freight train was struggling on the grade. The railroad brought with it not just goods, but time itself. Before the railroad, every town kept its own time based on the sun. When it was noon in Chicago, it was 11:50 in St. Louis, and 11:40 in Omaha. It was a chaotic mess for scheduling trains. The railroad needed precision. And so, in 1883, the railroads invented standard time. They divided the continent into 4 time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, Pacific. The clocks were synchronized. The sun was overruled by the schedule. The conductor's pocket watch became the ultimate authority. A high-grade railroad watch had to be accurate to within 30 seconds a week. It was inspected regularly. If a watch was off by a minute, it could cause a collision. The single track meant that trains had to meet at sidings. If one train was late, the other had to wait. The telegraph was the nervous system that controlled this flow. At every station, there was an operator tapping out Morse code. Dit-dit-da. Dit! They sent orders to the trains. Hold number 6 at Laramie. Number 12 is running late. The station agent was a man of importance. He was the link to the outside world. He knew the news before anyone else. He knew the price of wheat in Chicago and the winner of the election in Washington. The depot was the center of town life. People gathered there to watch the trains come in. It was a daily theater. The smoke on the horizon, the whistle in the distance, the growing roar. The screech of the brakes, the hustle of the passengers, the unloading of the mail bags. And then the departure, leaving the town quiet again. The railroad changed what people ate. Before the tracks, you ate what grew locally. Now you could get oysters in Denver packed in ice. You could get oranges in Chicago. You could get beef in New York that had been raised in Texas and shipped by rail. The refrigerator car changed the American diet. It was an insulated boxcar cooled by blocks of ice, harvested from frozen lakes in the winter. It kept the fruit fresh and the meat cold. The colossal scale of the freight trains that moved across the continent is hard to imagine. Trains of 50 or 60 cars stretching for a mile, loaded with lumber from Oregon, coal from Wyoming, wheat from Kansas. They were rivers of commerce, flowing on ribbons of steel. And let us not forget the maintenance of this iron spine. The track did not take care of itself. It required an army of men to keep it safe. The section gangs. They lived in section houses every 10 or 20 miles. Their job was to walk the track every day, rain or shine. They looked for loose spikes. They looked for cracked rails. They looked for washouts after a storm. They tightened bolts. They shoveled ballast. It was hard, unglamorous work, but it was vital. If a rail broke, a train would derail. If a switch was frozen, a train would crash. These men were the custodians of the line. They knew every foot of their section. They knew which culvert flooded in the spring. They knew which curve wore down. The rails the fastest. They worked with simple tools, the claw bar, the spike maul, the shovel, the lining bar. They sang as they worked to the rhythm of the song, coordinating their movements as they shifted the heavy track. Gandhi dancers, they were called, because of the way they moved in unison. And in the winter, the snowplows returned, the great rotary plows invented to conquer the Sierra snow. A massive wheel of blades powered by its own steam engine, pushed by 2 or 3 locomotives. It ate the snow. It chewed into the drifts and hurled the white powder 100 feet to the side. It was a spectacle of power. The snow flew in a great arc, creating a rainbow in the sunlight. Behind it, the track was clear, a black line in a white world. The battle against the elements never really ended. The railroad was a living thing that required constant feeding and care. It was a triumph of the Victorian will, a belief that man could conquer nature through machinery and organization. And as the century turned and the steam engines grew larger and more powerful, the Transcontinental Railroad remained the central artery of the nation. It had healed the wound of the Civil War. It had opened the West. It had created a new kind of country, one that was unified not just by law, but by iron. The silence of the map had been filled with the sound of the whistle. The empty spaces had been connected. And tonight, as you listen to this story, you can imagine yourself back in that velvet seat, watching the moon rise over the Nevada desert, listening to the clickety-clack of the wheels, feeling the gentle rock of the car, and knowing that you are part of a journey that changed the world forever. To truly know the railroad, one must know the night. The passenger sleeps in his velvet berth, but the railroad never sleeps. It is a creature of 24 hours. Let us shift our gaze from the luxury of the Pullman car to the roof of a freight train in the year 1880. It is midnight. The train is moving across the high plains of Wyoming. The wind is howling, a cold, biting wind that cuts through wool coats. On top of the boxcars, a lone figure is walking. This is the brakeman. His job is the most dangerous on the line. Before the invention of the air brake, trains had to be stopped by hand. When the engineer blew the whistle for brakes, the brakeman had to run along the tops of the moving cars, jumping the gap between them in the dark. Imagine the scene. The train is swaying and lurching. The roof is covered in frost or ice. The only light comes from the brakeman's lantern swinging in his hand. He reaches the brake wheel on the first car. He spins it hard, tightening the iron shoes against the wheels. Then he runs to the next car, and the next. If he slips, he falls between the cars and is lost. It is a job of terrifying precision performed in the pitch black. The sound of his boots on the wooden roof boards is lost in the roar of the wind. He is a silhouette against the stars, a shadow dancing on a moving platform. He knows the train by its rhythm. He knows when they are cresting a hill and the cars will bunch together. He knows when they are descending and the cars will stretch out. He is the physical force that controls the momentum of thousands of tons of steel. And down on the ground, at the lonely sidings, there are other watchers in the night. The water tank stops. Steam locomotives were thirsty beasts. They consumed thousands of gallons of water. Every 20 miles or so, there was a wooden water tank standing on stilts like a giant barrel. Beside it lived the pump man. His life was one of profound solitude. He lived in a small shack, often miles from the nearest town. His entire existence was devoted to the boiler that powered the pump. He had to keep the fire lit. He had to keep the water tank full, day and night. He listened for the whistle of the approaching train. When it stopped, he would climb the ladder and lower the spout. The water would rush into the tender with a heavy gushing sound. The fireman would wave. The engineer might shout a greeting. And then the train would leave hissing and chuffing into the dark, leaving the pump man alone again with the silence of the desert and the coyotes. These men were the hermits of the industrial age. They grew gardens in the desert dust. They read books by kerosene light. They watched the constellations wheel overhead, marking the passage of the seasons by the stars. And then there were the station agents on the night shift. In the small depots across Nevada and Utah, the telegraph key never stopped clicking. The agent sat in a pool of yellow light surrounded by shadows. The stove glowed red in the corner. The smell of stale coffee and ink filled the room. The sounder on the desk was his connection to the world. Click, clack, clickety-clack. He could read the Morse code as easily as you hear a voice. He heard the trains talking to each other across the miles. He knew that number 9 was delayed by a washout near Elko. He knew that the silk train from the coast was running fast and had the right of way. The silk trains were special. They carried raw silk from Asia unloaded from ships in San Francisco and rushed to the mills in the east. They were high-value cargo. They ran faster than the passenger trains. They stopped for nothing. The agent would listen to their progress, tracking their speed by the reports from other stations. When the silk train roared past his depot, it was a blur of darkness and wind, a sudden thunder that shook the windows and then vanished, leaving the telegraph key chattering in its wake. But the railroad was not just about isolation and danger, it was also about civilization. As the 1880s progressed, a new phenomenon appeared along the tracks: the Harvey House. Before Fred Harvey, eating on the railroad was a grim experience. Trains stopped at eating houses, where the food was often rancid, the coffee bitter and the service surly. Fred Harvey changed that. He struck a deal with the Santa Fe Railroad, and later his influence spread across the West. He believed that the traveler deserved a fine meal, served with dignity. Imagine stepping off a dusty train in the middle of the New Mexico desert and walking into a Harvey House. The dining room was spotless, the floors were scrubbed, the tables were set with Irish linen and English silver. The food was fresh. Oysters packed in ice, steaks from Kansas City, fresh fruit. And the service was provided by the Harvey girls. These were young women recruited from the East and the Midwest. They were of good character, smart and disciplined. They wore black dresses with starched white aprons and cuffs. They lived in dormitories presided over by a house mother. They brought a sense of order and grace to the rough frontier. The service was a choreographed ballet. The train would telegraph the number of passengers ahead, so the cooks knew exactly how many steaks to grill. When the train pulled in, a gong would sound. The passengers would file in. The first course was already on the table. The Harvey girls moved in unison, pouring coffee serving plates, clearing tables. You had exactly 30 minutes to eat. There was no rushing, but there was no wasted time. It was a machine of hospitality. The Harvey House became a beacon of culture. It was often the only place in town where you could get a good meal and a clean tablecloth. The girls often married local ranchers or railroad men, settling the West One dining room at a time. The sound of the Harvey House was the clinking of silver on china, the low murmur of conversation and the hiss of the coffee urn. It was a civilizing rhythm in a wild land. Let us return to the tracks themselves and the changing of the seasons. The railroad was a ribbon of iron that ran through the heart of nature, and the seasons played out against the backdrop of the rails. In the spring, the high plains of Nebraska and Wyoming would burst into color. The snow melted, leaving behind pools of water that reflected the sky. The grass turned a brilliant emerald green. Wildflowers appeared, bluebells, Indian paintbrush sunflowers, creating carpets of color that stretched to the horizon. The buffalo calves were born stumbling on knobby legs near the tracks. The air smelled of wet earth and new growth. The section gangs were busy repairing the damage of winter, fixing the washouts, and replacing the ties that had rotted in the snow. Then came the summer. The heat. The shimmering waves of air rising off the ballast. The metal of the rails expanded in the heat, sometimes warping or sun-kinking if they were laid too tight. The workers had to watch for this. The grass turned brown and dry. The risk of fire was high. A spark from a smokestack could ignite the prairie, setting off a wall of flame that raced faster than a horse. The railroad plowed fireguard strips of bare earth on either side of the tracks to stop the flames. The thunderstorms of summer were violent and spectacular. Towering cumulus clouds would build up in the afternoon, turning black and purple. The lightning would arc across the sky, illuminating the vast emptiness. The rain would fall in sheets, turning the dust to mud. And then the autumn, the best season for the railroad. The air turned crisp and cool. The light became golden and slanted. The aspen trees in the mountains turned a shocking yellow, quaking in the wind. The harvest trains began to run, mile-long trains of boxcars filled with wheat from the Dakotas, corn from Iowa, and cattle from the ranges. It was the season of movement, the feeling of abundance. The railroad was the artery that carried the lifeblood of the nation's harvest. And finally, the winter returned. The circle closed. The snow fences were repaired. The plows were readied. The cycle of the seasons was marked by the passing of the trains. The specific sounds of the railroad also changed with the weather. In the cold winter air, the sound carried further. The whistle of a locomotive could be heard for 20 miles, a sharp, clear note that hung in the frozen air. In the humid summer, the sound was softer, more muffled. The clickety-clack of the wheels sounded different on wet rails than on dry ones. A wet rail sang a higher pitch. A snow-covered rail was muffled and dull. The engineer listened to these changes. He knew the ayam mayast voice of the track. He knew the hollow boom of a bridge and the solid rumble of a fill. He knew the screech of the flanges on a tight curve. It was a symphony of steel and stone. The cargo, too, told a story. In the early days, it was supplies for the miners and the settlers. Picks, shovels, flour, whiskey. Then it was the raw materials coming back. Gold, silver, copper. Then came the cattle. The great cattle drives from Texas ended at the railheads in Kansas, Abilene, Dodge City. The cattle were loaded into stock cars, the sound of thousands of hooves on wooden ramps, the lowing of the herds, the smell of the stockyards. The railroad transformed the cattle industry. It allowed beef to be shipped fresh to the cities of the East. Then came the fruit. The refrigerator car turned California into the orchard of America. Oranges, lemons, grapes. The smell of citrus wafted from the yellow refrigerator cars known as reefers. They were iced at stations along the way. Great blocks of ice slid into the hatches on the roof. The railroad created a national market. You could eat a California orange in a Boston winter. It was a miracle of logistics. And let us not forget the mail. The Railway Post Office, or RPO. These were special cars where the mail was sorted en route. The clerks were the elite of the postal service. They had to know the geography of the country by heart. They stood at sorting tables as the train rocked and swayed, tossing letters into pigeonholes with lightning speed. They worked under pressure. The mail had to be ready by the time the train reached the next junction. At small stations where the IJ train didn't stop, they used the catcher pouch. A mail bag was hung on a crane by the side of the track. As the train roared past, a metal arm on the mail car would swing out and snatch the bag. At the same time, the clerk would kick out the delivery bag. It happened in a split second. A blur of canvas and iron. Wham! The bag was on board. The mail was the heartbeat of communication. Letters from loved ones, business contracts, newspapers, love letters. All flowing through the veins of the iron spine. The railroad also changed the landscape of sound. Before the train, the loudest sound on the plains was thunder. Now there was the steam whistle. It became the clock of the community. The 5:15 was the signal to stop work. The Midnight Express was a comforting reminder that the world was still turning. The railroad brought the sound of the circus train. Once a year, the circus would come to town on a special train of brightly painted cars. The calliope would play, the elephants would be unloaded. It was a day of magic brought by the rails, and it brought the sound of the political campaign train. The whistle-stop tour. The candidate would stand on the rear platform of the observation car, speaking to the crowd gathered at the depot. The bunting draped over the railing, the brass band playing, the steam hissing. It was the theater of democracy played out on the tracks. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the railroad continued to evolve. The iron rails were replaced by steel, which was stronger and lasted longer. The wood-burning engines were replaced by coal and then by oil. The cars became heavier and more luxurious. Electric lights replaced the oil lamps, but the essence remained the same. It was the conquest of distance. It was the rhythm of the journey.
The night train crossing the desert is still one of the most evocative images of the American experience. Imagine standing by the tracks in the middle of the Nevada night. The silence is absolute. The stars are diamond hard. Then you hear it, a low hum in the rails, then a distant whistle. Then a light appears on the horizon, a single piercing eye. The sound grows, a rhythmic chuffing. The ground begins to tremble, and then the train rushes past, a wall of noise and wind and flashing windows. You see brief glimpses of lives inside, a woman reading, a man sleeping, a waiter stacking plates, and then the red lights of the caboose fade into the distance, and the silence rushes back in. But the air is changed. It is charged with the energy of passage. The railroad has left its mark. It is a memory of steel and steam that lingers in the quiet of the desert. This is the legacy of the iron spine. It is not just history, it is a feeling of motion, of connection, of the vastness of the continent tamed by the ingenuity of man. And as you drift deeper into sleep, you can still hear it, the faint whistle in the distance, the steady rhythm of the wheels, carrying you on a journey through the night, through the history, through the dream of the Iron Road. As the 20th century gathered momentum, the railroad transformed from a jagged scar across the frontier into the sleek, beating heart of the nation. The wooden depots of the 1880s gave way to the cathedrals of commerce. In the great cities, Chicago, New York, St. Louis, massive Union stations rose like temples of stone and glass. To enter one was to step into a cavern of echoes. The sunlight filtered through high vaulted windows, catching the dust motes raised by thousands of hurrying feet. The air smelled of ozone, coal smoke, and expensive tobacco. Above the din, the disembodied voice of the announcer boomed, listing destinations like a litany of exotic spells, now boarding for Omaha, Cheyenne, Salt Lake City, and San Francisco. It was the theater of arrival and departure, where soldiers kissed sweethearts goodbye and immigrants stepped onto the platform to breathe their first lungful of a new city. But out on the lines, a shadow world existed parallel to the paying passengers. The Great Depression of the 1930s birthed a new kind of traveler, the hobo. These were not merely bums, they were the knights of the road, wandering workers following the harvest or searching for hope. They rode the blinds, the space between the baggage car and the tender, or huddled in empty boxcars. They developed their own language, a code of symbols chalked on water tanks and fence posts. A drawing of a cat meant a kind lady lived nearby. A jagged line meant a dangerous dog. A simple cross meant get out fast, the police are brutal. They gathered in jungle camps near the rail yards, sharing a pot of mulligan stew over a fire made of old railroad ties. For them, the train was not a luxury. It was a beast to be tamed, a dangerous free ride that could cost a man his leg or his life if the bulls, the railroad detectives, caught him. Then came the age of speed. The Art Deco era brought the streamliners, the Burlington Zephyr, the Super Chief. These were not the clanking black iron horses of the past. They were bullets of stainless steel and chrome, gleaming silver under the sun. They looked like they were moving even when they were standing still. Inside, the design was fluid and modern. The seats were plush velvet. The observation cars had rounded ends with panoramic windows, allowing the landscape to rush away behind you. The rough frontier had been smoothed over. You could sip a martini in the club car while the rugged Rocky Mountains slid past the glass like a movie projection. The rhythm changed too. The clickety-clack became a rapid, seamless hum as welding technology improved the rails. The journey was no longer a struggle. It was a glide. Yet the greatest shift was in the sound. Slowly, the mournful, human-like wail of the steam whistle began to fade. It was replaced by the deep, guttural horn of the diesel electric. The steam locomotive was a living thing. It breathed, it drank water, it needed to be fed coal, it hissed when it rested. The diesel was a machine. It was efficient, powerful, and cleaner, but it lacked the romance of the fire. The roundhouses, once filled with the smoke and clamor of boilermakers and hostlers, grew quieter. The water towers on the lonely sidings began to rot and fall, their purpose gone. The pump man, the hermit of the desert, was no longer needed. The train could run for hundreds of miles without stopping for a drink. The isolation of the railway worker deepened in a new way. He was now a technician monitoring gauges, not a fireman battling a furnace.
By the middle of the century, the automobile and the airplane began to steal the passengers. The highways, ribbons of asphalt, promised a different kind of freedom. The freedom to go where the rails did not. The great passenger fleets began to thin out. The silver dining cars were parked on sidings, the linen gathering dust. But the freight remained. The muscle of the railroad never atrophied. It shifted from the romance of travel to the brutal efficiency of logistics. The intermodal container appeared, steel boxes stacked too high, miles of them, a moving wall of commerce. The caboose, That friendly red house at the end of the train where the brakeman once waved to children vanished, replaced by a blinking electronic device called a FRED, flashing rear-end device. Today, if you stand by those same tracks in Wyoming, the ghosts are still there. The silence of the high plains is still torn apart by the roar of the engines, though they are now diesel giants painted in corporate colors. But watch closely at night. When the high beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the sagebrush and the snow, you can feel the weight of what came before. The ballast creates a path walked by millions of unseen feet. The old telegraph poles, many now wireless crosses against the moon, stand as monuments to the first network that bound the continent. To know the railroad is to understand that it is a timeline. It connects the 1880 brakeman freezing on a roof walk to the modern engineer monitoring a computer screen. It connects the silk from Asia to the Amazon package on your doorstep. The iron spine is older now, weathered and changed, but the blood still flows. The train passes, a thunder of wheels, a rush of wind, and then it is gone. And in the sudden quiet that follows, if you listen with the ears of history, you can still hear the phantom click of the telegraph key, chattering out the news of a world that was built, mile by heavy mile, on the back of the rail. The journey continues, echoing forever into the American night. But the story does not end in the silence of the desert. It lives on in the quiet corners of the land where the past still breathes. There are places where the iron road has been abandoned. Walk into the deep woods of Appalachia or the forests of the Pacific Northwest. You will find the ghost tracks. The rails are gone, pulled up for scrap metal long ago, but the roadbed remains, a flat scar cutting through the trees. The wooden ties are rotting, returning to the earth. Moss covers the stone bridges. It is a green tunnel of memory. You can almost hear the phantom whistle echoing off the hills. These abandoned lines are the veins of a giant that has gone to sleep. Nature is reclaiming them. Saplings grow between the rotting ties. Deer walk the paths where locomotives once thundered. It is a reminder that everything man builds eventually returns to nature. Yet in other places, the spirit is kept alive by fire and water. The preservationists, the volunteers, they are the keepers of the flame. In dusty roundhouses on weekends, they put on grease-stained overalls. They polish the brass bells. They lubricate the driving rods. They light the fires in the cold fireboxes. They bring the beasts back to life. When a restored steam engine pulls out of the station, it is not just a machine, it is a time machine. The smell of the coal smoke triggers a deep memory in the DNA of the crowd. The sound of the chuffing is the heartbeat of the Industrial Revolution. Children who have only known electric cars stare in awe at the monster of steel and steam. It is a sensory overload. The heat, the noise, the vibration. It teaches them that the world was built with sweat and muscle. And then there is the future. The railroad is not dead. It is evolving. The high-speed rails, the magnetic levitation, the bullet trains that slice through the air like arrows, they are the new generation. They are silent and smooth and fast. They do not have the romance of the steam, but they have the purpose to connect, to move, to shrink the world. The impulse is the same. The desire to see what is over the next horizon. The desire to be in motion. So tonight, when you lie in bed and hear the distant horn of a freight train crossing the valley, listen closely. It is not just a horn. It is a voice. It is the voice of the brakeman walking the roof in the snow. It is the voice of the Harvey girl serving coffee. It is the voice of the hobo riding the blinds. It is the voice of the soldier going to war and the immigrant coming home. It is the song of the iron spine. The track goes on forever. The signals change from red to green. The wheels turn. The journey never ends. The railroad is the river of steel that flows through the heart of the nation, and we are all passengers riding the current into the dawn.